If you call him a monster again, say it where he can hear you. Aaliyah's words crossed the marble breakfast room before caution could pull them back, and every fork, cup, and quiet conversation seemed to stop at once. Park Min-kyu turned toward her with the offended disbelief of a man unaccustomed to being corrected by staff, while Han Tae-jun slowly lowered the financial report he had been reading at the far end of the table. Aaliyah had worked at the estate for 4 days, she was 31 weeks pregnant, and the health insurance attached to the job mattered more than her pride could afford to admit. She had already heard 2 jokes about Tae-jun's size, but Min-kyu's remark about the reinforced dining chair had been delivered loudly enough to invite the entire room to laugh with him. Aaliyah set the coffee tray on the sideboard, steadied one hand beneath her stomach, and met Min-kyu's stare even as fear tightened behind her ribs. "If it is funny," she said, "it should still be funny when the person you are talking about is sitting 10 feet away." Min-kyu's face hardened, and his voice dropped into the smooth, contemptuous register that made humiliation sound like etiquette. "You are staff, so I suggest you remember what you are paid to do," he said, glancing toward Tae-jun, as if expecting the head of the household to finish the punishment for him. Aaliyah felt the old arithmetic begin inside her. Rent, prenatal visits, unpaid leave, groceries, the 1,000 private calculations that taught working people when dignity became too expensive to defend. "Serving breakfast is my job," she answered, keeping her voice even. But pretending cruelty is invisible was never in the description. Tae-jun closed the folder in front of him, and although the movement was quiet, everyone in the room noticed, because men like him had trained people to notice even their silences. At 6'4" and more than 300 pounds, he had spent years turning other people's unease into a form of authority, and Aaliyah could not tell whether she had just insulted his cousin or exposed something Tae-jun preferred left covered. "Come here," he said, and she crossed the room already imagining the sentence that would end her employment. Tae-jun studied her for several seconds, not with anger exactly, but with the wary concentration of someone deciding whether honesty was another form of attack. "Are you always this willing to correct people who can fire you?" he asked, while Min-kyu leaned back with a faint smile that suggested the entertainment had finally improved. Aaliyah rested her palm against the curve of her stomach, because she needed Tae-jun to see the truth before he judged the defiance. "I am terrified of losing this job," she said, and the admission changed the room more completely than bravery would have. Tae-jun's gaze dropped briefly to her hand, then returned to her face with something quieter than surprise. "Then why say anything?" he asked, and Aaliyah swallowed before answering, because there were times when a simple sentence cost more than shouting. Because being afraid of the consequence does not make the insult less wrong, and because everyone here acted like your humiliation was the price of keeping breakfast pleasant. For the first time, Min-kyu stopped smiling, while Tae-jun looked toward him with an expression so calm that the house staff suddenly found reasons to disappear into adjacent rooms. "Apologize," Tae-jun said, and Min-kyu stared at him as though he had misheard the order. "To her?" he asked, and Tae-jun shook his head once before answering. "To me," because she already explained why. Min-kyu muttered something stiff and inadequate, then left with the strained dignity of a man promising himself this was not over. When the door finally closed, Aaliyah reached for the coffee tray and told Tae-jun he could dismiss her without making a scene, but he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the empty chair his cousin had occupied and said, "Min-kyu is coordinating the Seoul delegation arriving tomorrow, and those men can decide whether a very expensive expansion survives the winter." Aaliyah's stomach tightened, but Tae-jun's next words were quieter and more unsettling. "So before tomorrow night, I need to know whether you defended me because you think I am weak, or because you believe I should stop acting like humiliation is useful." Aaliyah kept one hand on the tray and considered the question long enough for Tae-jun's expression to tighten, because men accustomed to immediate answers often mistook thoughtful silence for resistance. "Neither," she said at last. "I defended you because your cousin was cruel, and whether you can survive cruelty has nothing to do with whether everyone else should practice it." Tae-jun looked almost disappointed by the simplicity of that answer, then glanced toward the untouched breakfast in front of him. "You do not think I needed rescuing?" he asked, and Aaliyah gave him a tired look that carried more honesty than courtesy. "Mr. Han, you own 3 companies, frighten half the people who enter this house, and could probably fire me before I reach the kitchen. So no, Rescuing you was not on my schedule." Something unfamiliar moved across his face, and for the first time since she arrived, his smile appeared without being used as armor. "Good," he said, "because I would not know what to do with pity." Before sunrise the next morning, Aaliyah found him standing alone beside the kitchen island, staring at a covered plate, as though breakfast had become a negotiation he intended to win by refusing participation. She lifted the cover, saw eggs, toast, and sliced pear untouched beneath it, then asked whether he planned to intimidate the food until it surrendered. Tae-jun glanced at her, noticed the way she shifted her weight to ease pressure in her lower back, and immediately told her to sit down. "There you go again," she said, lowering herself carefully onto a stool anyway, turning concern into an order because asking apparently threatens national security. He frowned, then tried again with visible effort. "Would you like to sit?" Aaliyah nodded, and the correction seemed almost absurdly small until she realized how rarely anyone in his life had required him to separate care from control. Tae-jun sat across from her, looked at the plate, and said quietly that his father had begun weighing him every Sunday when he was 8 years old. He spoke without drama, which made the memory more painful, describing a scale placed beside the bathroom door and a father who called shame discipline, because discipline sounded respectable. By 12, Tae-jun had learned to skip breakfast before family gatherings, and by adulthood he had mastered the more sophisticated version, ordering generously for everyone else while claiming he had already eaten. Aaliyah listened without turning his confession into a lesson, then told him she had noticed the chairs changed before meetings, the standing during long presentations, and the way he laughed first whenever someone commented on his body. "You observe too much," he said, and she shrugged carefully. "People usually say that when they mean, 'I noticed something they hoped nobody would name.'" Tae-jun looked at her body, caught himself before disguising the glance, and admitted that he had almost assumed she understood him because she was plus-size too. Aaliyah shook her head and told him their bodies did not make their lives interchangeable, because strangers did not enter rooms fearing her before she spoke, although she knew exactly what it meant when people treated size as public property. The confession might have become intimacy if the kitchen door had not opened and Min-kyu entered with Chairman Lee Do-hyun's schedule in one hand and irritation already prepared on his face. He announced that the Seoul delegation would arrive at 2, then warned Tae-jun that the men coming had heard he was changing, a word delivered with enough contempt to make its meaning obvious. Min-kyu mentioned 2 dismissed security contractors, breakfast meetings Tae-jun had stopped avoiding, and staff members who had apparently become comfortable speaking without fear, while his eyes repeatedly shifted toward Aaliyah. Tae-jun listened until Min-kyu finally said, "They respected you because challenging you had a cost," then answered with a calmness that unsettled his cousin more than anger would have. "They feared me because fear was efficient, and I spent too long pretending efficiency and respect were the same thing." Min-kyu warned that kindness would not protect him in the meeting ahead, but Tae-jun only asked whether cruelty had ever protected him from men who already considered his body evidence against his discipline. As Min-kyu left, Aaliyah noticed a conference tablet tucked beneath his folder and a message flashing across its screen from Lee's chief of staff, requesting access to the delegation's private investor forum. At 2 that afternoon, the Seoul delegation entered the estate with dark coats, polished shoes, and the restrained courtesy of men who had decided to evaluate more than the numbers placed before them. Chairman Lee took the narrowest chair in the formal sitting room, a gesture so deliberate that Aaliyah understood the insult before anyone spoke, while his chief of staff placed the same conference tablet on a side table near Min-kyu. Tae-jun chose the reinforced chair near the fireplace without apology, poured his own tea, and began with revenue projections as though refusing to acknowledge the theater arranged around him. Lee interrupted after 3 minutes to say profitability could make a leader comfortable, then let his gaze travel across Tae-jun's body. "Appearance becomes part of judgment," Lee said, using the language of governance to disguise something far more ordinary. Tae-jun looked directly at him and asked, "Are you evaluating my judgment, or are you asking me to defend the size of my body before we discuss your money?" The question removed the politeness Lee had been hiding behind, and for several seconds nobody moved except the chief of staff, who touched the tablet screen and quickly lowered his hand. Lee said some partners believed Tae-jun looked less disciplined and less formidable than he had 2 years earlier, then added that markets responded to perception, whether perception was fair or not. Aaliyah watched Tae-jun's right hand tighten once against the chair before relaxing. "My weight has changed," he said, "but the debt ratio did not gain 20 pounds, our logistics network did not miss projections, and none of your concerns appeared in the financial review you sent yesterday." Lee leaned forward and asked whether Tae-jun was denying that leadership depended on self-control. Tae-jun could have ended the subject with threat, sarcasm, or the cold authority everyone expected, but he instead admitted that he had spent years laughing before other people could laugh at him. "That habit made me look unbothered," he said, "but it also taught dishonest people that shame was a lever they could pull whenever they wanted something." Lee's expression changed, not toward sympathy, but toward calculation. And that distinction mattered because Tae-jun finally understood the meeting had never been about concern for his health. He redirected the conversation to the expansion terms, challenged an inflated exclusivity demand, and forced Lee's team to revise 2 assumptions about distribution costs before anyone touched the subject of appearance again. 40 minutes later, the delegation requested a private dinner before making a final decision, which was not victory, but was far from the collapse Min-kyu had predicted. As Aaliyah gathered cups, she noticed Lee's chief of staff return the conference tablet to Min-kyu and say quietly that the investor forum access was working now. Min-kyu nodded without looking at the screen, distracted by Tae-jun's refusal to follow him into the hall for an immediate debrief. The chief of staff looked at Aaliyah afterward with an expression that felt less like curiosity than inventory. She told herself she was tired, over-alert, and 8 weeks from giving birth, then carried the tray toward the kitchen without giving the moment more importance than it deserved. An hour later, Min-kyu found her outside the library and accused her of being proud that Tae-jun had exposed weakness in front of men who could delay the company's expansion by a year. Aaliyah told him she had not instructed Tae-jun to confess anything, and Min-kyu answered that she was the first person his cousin listened to without immediately calculating what she wanted in return. "What happens when you leave?" he asked, glancing at her stomach. "You think he keeps becoming this version of himself after you are gone?" The question unsettled her because it suggested a dependency she had never agreed to create. And before she could answer, Tae-jun appeared at the end of the hall and asked what had happened. Min-kyu's phone vibrated first, then Tae-jun's. Then Aaliyah heard another notification from inside the library, a sequence too synchronized to be ordinary. Min-kyu looked at his screen and went pale before turning it toward them. A photograph from the investor meeting showed Tae-jun seated beside the fireplace while Aaliyah served tea, and beneath it, someone had written, "The giant has gone soft," and apparently the maid is holding the leash. Aaliyah stared at the image until the insult stopped feeling personal and started feeling deliberate, because whoever posted it had not merely mocked 2 bodies or 2 social positions. They had transformed her presence into evidence that Tae-jun's judgment could be compromised. Tae-jun took the phone without speaking, and Aaliyah watched the familiar armor return to his face so quickly that she understood why fear had once seemed easier than reflection. "I can make this disappear," he said, already reaching for his own phone, but Aaliyah stopped him by asking what exactly he intended to erase. The photograph had been taken legally by the delegation's corporate photographer, yet nobody had authorized its private circulation, and the caption had been added before the image reached the forum. "I want my image removed if legal can do it without spreading it further," she said, "and I want to know who distributed it, but I do not want a statement calling me the woman who changed you." Tae-jun looked at her sharply, then asked what she wanted him to say about himself. "Nothing defensive," Aaliyah answered, "because if you spend tomorrow proving you are not soft, whoever posted this gets to decide what strength looks like." Min-kyu argued that reputation damage required aggression, but Tae-jun finally told legal to document the breach, preserve the access records, and identify who had touched the forum before anyone accused a specific person. The first report arrived before midnight and immediately tempted Tae-jun towards certainty. The upload had been made through credentials assigned to Min-kyu. The caption had been entered from a conference tablet registered to the hospitality suite, and the image had been forwarded twice before appearing publicly inside the private forum. Tae-jun read the report standing behind his desk, while Aaliyah sat nearby with swollen feet elevated on a low ottoman, pretending she was not watching him struggle against the conclusion he wanted. "Access is not proof," she said before he could speak, and he gave her a look that suggested restraint felt like an insult. Legal confirmed that 4 people had handled the tablet that afternoon, including Min-kyu and Lee's chief of staff, which turned suspicion into a corridor rather than a destination. Tae-jun called neither man that night, although twice he picked up his phone before stopping himself. "Waiting feels like letting someone win," he admitted, and Aaliyah told him that waiting for facts was not surrender unless anger had become his preferred source of certainty. Min-kyu arrived the next morning already knowing why he had been summoned, and the confidence he usually wore seemed thinner around the edges. Tae-jun placed the report between them and asked why his credentials had been used, while Aaliyah remained in the room only after Tae-jun asked whether she wanted to stay. Min-kyu admitted that Lee's chief of staff could not access the investor forum through his temporary account, so he had handed over a logged-in tablet for what he claimed was 10 minutes. Tae-jun's anger became colder when Min-kyu acknowledged that the same man had joked about his body during dinner and had shown Min-kyu a draft of the caption before the upload appeared. "Did you post it?" Tae-jun asked, and Min-kyu said no without hesitation. "Did you stop him?" Tae-jun asked next, and this time Min-kyu looked down before admitting that he had called the caption cruel, then laughed anyway, because refusing to laugh would have placed him outside the group. The answer hurt more than a clean betrayal, because cowardice had been sitting beside Tae-jun for years, wearing the face of family. Min-kyu finally admitted that standing beside Tae-jun had always made him afraid of comparison, because when strangers mocked the larger, more powerful cousin, joining them guaranteed Min-kyu would not become the next target. Tae-jun listened without interrupting, then removed him from investor communications until legal completed the review and ordered him to correct the delegation's record about how his credentials had been used. Min-kyu protested that the admission would humiliate him, and Tae-jun answered that accountability often felt like humiliation when someone had spent years controlling which part of the truth other people could see. After Min-kyu left, legal called again with a detail that changed the shape of the entire incident. The chief of staff had not merely uploaded the photograph, he had forwarded it first to 2 potential investors with a message asking whether Tae-jun's recent decisions showed undue personal influence from inside the household. Attached beneath that message was a draft amendment to the investment agreement, giving Lee's group unusually broad authority to challenge leadership decisions they considered damaging to reputation. Aaliyah read the language twice, then looked at Tae-jun and understood that the insult had never been careless gossip. Someone had been manufacturing weakness so they could sell him protection from it. For several minutes, Tae-jun said nothing, and the silence no longer resembled the controlled intimidation he used in meetings, because this time he was calculating a cost he could not make disappear by frightening someone. Lee's group was offering enough capital to accelerate 2 distribution projects, protect executive bonuses, and move a planned expansion forward by nearly 6 months. While rejecting the deal would leave the company stable, but force delays that other employees would feel. Aaliyah watched him read the amendment again, then told him not to reject anything simply because the discovery made him angry. "If you walk away to prove you are strong, they still made the decision for you," she said, and Tae-jun looked irritated because she had named the temptation accurately. He called his chief financial officer, counsel, and division heads, asked the real cost of losing the investment, and spent hours listening before deciding. By noon, the answer was clear enough to hurt. The company would survive, but several teams would lose bonuses, hiring would freeze temporarily, and 2 launches would move into the next fiscal year. Chairman Lee arrived by video call expecting a negotiation over the amendment, and Tae-jun surprised him by beginning with the numbers rather than the insult. He explained exactly what walking away would cost Han Holdings, acknowledged that the company would feel the delay, then asked Lee why a private photograph had been circulated, alongside language that later appeared inside a proposed control clause. Lee denied authorizing the post, but he defended the amendment as reasonable protection against reputational volatility, which told Tae-jun more than a confession would have. "You created a narrative that my judgment had been compromised," Tae-jun said, then offered me capital on the condition that you receive power to correct that supposed weakness. Lee answered that business rewarded people who understood perception, and Tae-jun finally recognized the same lesson his father had taught him on a bathroom scale decades earlier. If someone could convince him that his body revealed a defect, they could sell him discipline, obedience, silence, or approval as the cure. Tae-jun declined the revised agreement, not dramatically, but after stating the financial consequences allowed, so nobody could later pretend principle had been free. The decision divided his board before the afternoon ended, and criticism reached him faster than support because anger always traveled efficiently through executive corridors. Two directors accused him of sacrificing momentum over personal offense. One privately suggested that Aaliyah's influence had become a governance concern, and Min-kyu sent a message saying he understood if Tae-jun never trusted him the same way again. Aaliyah found Tae-jun that evening in the kitchen with a bowl of soup cooling untouched before him, his suit jacket abandoned over a chair and exhaustion showing plainly across his face. "Today went badly?" she asked, and he shook his head. "It went correctly, which turns out to be more expensive." She sat across from him because her ankles were swollen and because neither of them needed another conversation performed from opposite sides of a hierarchy. Tae-jun admitted that part of him wanted everyone to praise the decision so the cost would feel justified, then looked almost embarrassed by the confession. Aaliyah told him that growth did not guarantee applause, and right decisions could still inconvenience innocent people, which was why good intentions were never enough. He finally began eating, then asked whether she had decided what would happen after maternity leave, and the question changed the room more sharply than anything Lee had said. Aaliyah told him she had not decided whether returning to the estate would still make sense for her daughter, her body, or the life she wanted after childbirth. Disappointment crossed Tae-jun's face before he could hide it, and Aaliyah saw immediately how easy it would be for him to turn that feeling into an offer too generous to refuse. "Do not make my staying proof that you changed," she said, and Tae-jun looked down because the accusation reached a place he had not yet examined. He admitted that Min-kyu's warning had frightened him, not because he believed Aaliyah controlled him, but because being around her made the harder choice easier to recognize. "Then recognize it when I am gone," she answered, resting both hands over the child shifting beneath her ribs. Tae-jun nodded slowly, and for once he did not promise anything grand. He simply said that if his better choices depended on keeping one employee close, then they had never belonged to him in the first place. 4 weeks later, Aaliyah stood in the front hall with her maternity leave packet beneath one arm and a small overnight bag at her feet, waiting for the car that would take her home. The estate looked unchanged, all pale stone and dark wood, but Tae-jun came downstairs without a phone, folder, or assistant behind him. He asked whether she had decided what she wanted after leave, then stopped himself from filling the silence when she took several seconds to answer. "I am not coming back as a live-in maid," Aaliyah said, and disappointment moved through his face without becoming pressure. She explained that if she returned, she wanted day shifts, predictable weekends, a formal job description, and a workplace policy preventing managers from accessing medical restrictions beyond what scheduling actually required. Tae-jun almost said done, caught the warning in her expression, and corrected himself by promising to send the proposal through human resources and counsel before anyone treated his preference as policy. Aaliyah smiled, because the correction mattered more than agreement ever could. She also told him that the job had to work for her life, not for his emotional development, and Tae-jun accepted the sentence without pretending it was easy. During the previous month, the abandoned Seoul deal had remained abandoned. 2 board members had resigned, and a domestic investment group had entered preliminary discussions under terms that did not grant anyone authority over Tae-jun's private relationships or household staff. Min-kyu had returned in a reduced role after issuing a written correction, completing compliance training, and accepting that trust would recover more slowly than his reputation. Several people still whispered that Tae-jun had become soft after allowing a maid to influence him. "For a while, I liked that version of the story," he admitted, looking toward the windows instead of at Aaliyah. "If you changed me, then I could blame you if I changed back." Aaliyah let the statement sit between them until Tae-jun finally added that she had not made him decent. She had only made his excuses harder to believe. The car arrived outside, and Tae-jun reached automatically for Aaliyah's bag before stopping with his hand halfway there. "Would you like me to carry that?" he asked, and she laughed softly before saying yes. At the door, he told her to come back when she was ready, then corrected himself again when she raised an eyebrow. "Come back if the job still deserves you," he said, and Aaliyah nodded because that was the first invitation he had given her that contained no hidden obligation. Months later, she returned 3 days a week under a written schedule, with clearer responsibilities and enough authority to refuse work that belonged to someone else. The estate had not become gentle in some miraculous way, and Tae-jun had not become easy, because real change rarely replaced an entire personality with a more convenient one. He still had a temper, still preferred control when uncertainty made him uncomfortable, and still occasionally apologized after realizing he had given an order where a question would have been better. What changed was smaller, harder, and therefore more believable. Staff accommodations were discussed instead of assumed, furniture came in different sizes without apology, and nobody in the house was expected to laugh when Humiliation entered the room wearing the costume of a joke. Min-kyu and Tae-jun rebuilt their relationship slowly, with fewer performances of loyalty and more uncomfortable conversations about the years when both men had mistaken silence for strength. The new investment eventually closed on cleaner terms, months later than originally planned, after Tae-jun refused a clause allowing outside partners to police personal conduct that had no measurable connection to performance. At the first dinner celebrating that agreement, an executive from another firm looked toward Tae-jun's chair and made a careless joke about needing industrial engineering for the furniture. The room waited for Tae-jun to laugh first, exactly as he had done for years, but he simply looked at the man and said that if his body was the strongest argument available, they could finish dinner early. Across the room, Aaliyah continued pouring coffee until their eyes met, then gave him the smallest nod, because nobody had tamed a monster. A man had finally stopped using other people's cruelty as permission to become one.